Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? I think this mic is a little bit quieter. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much, Max and Vika and Sarah, of course, for organizing this symposium. And it's my great pleasure to be able to talk to Fiona Shields, who's been heavily involved in the selection of images as well for the exhibition. So I just thought we would think about some of the kind of broader issues to do with how images are selected, and then move on to these more ethical conundrums that the exhibition tries to address. But maybe to begin with, Fiona, maybe do you want to just talk us a little bit through your path to how did you become head of photography at The Guardian? And I guess what's changed in the years in your experience?
Well, I mean, I was introduced to the idea of journalism by my English teacher at school, actually. And I think at the time I thought I would live a life of kind of writing for glossy women's magazines, lovely lifestyle kind of stuff. Honestly, it couldn't have turned out more differently. But first of all, I think because when I came to college, I went to the London College of Printing to study journalism. At that time in London, my mind was really expanded. It was a time of huge kind of political and social sort of turmoil, a lot of activism around me. I'd come from quite a sort of a very sort of safe little bubble in Edinburgh, to be honest. So it was really exciting. I became interested in photography when I was there. For one of my assignments, I went to interview the war photographer, Tim Page, which was really interesting. And I'd been reading Michael Herr's book, Dispatches. So there was a kind of dawning on me about how the importance of imagery in telling, the kind of vital stories of our time. And so coupled with the fact that it turned out I was quite a terrible writer. My strengths lay in visual storytelling. I was working for a current affairs magazine doing kind of layout and picture selection before I moved on to newspapers. When I came to The Guardian, it was actually, I realised, my spiritual home. I mean, I've really leaned into the sort of philosophy at The Guardian. I think, the idea that we're often telling stories that others aren't telling, or exposing injustices, holding authorities to account. The fact that it does actually take photography, quality photography, very seriously has been really important to me. So I've been there for just over 20 years now. I'm not going to admit exactly how long. And yeah, things have changed a lot. When I first joined The Guardian, most photographers were working in film, and now everybody's working digitally. We can receive pictures all around the world from just moments after they were taken. And that also, now that we're publishing digitally, that means that we can also publish moments after they were taken. And I think that's kind of changed our practice completely.
Yeah, that dynamic of instantaneous access to conflict and the problems that arise with that, as well as opportunities. So maybe give us a little bit of a sense of what it looks like behind the scenes. I mean, one of the things that I was really struck with when we were talking about this conversation in preparation was just how many images you sift through. So what takes you from, if we look at one of these images, what's the story that's taking this image from being taken to being selected?
Okay, so I mean, you may be really surprised to know that we receive often more than 30,000 images a day. That's within a 24-hour period. And the news picture editors sift through every one of those so that we make sure that we miss nothing that's really important. And often the stories come from seeing the pictures first, like the news desks don't necessarily know that something's occurred. We might see the pictures first and alert them to something happening. But those pictures are coming from all over the world. They're coming from Associated Press, Reuters, Getty, our own photographers who are on commission, and often, citizen journalists as well who are providing images. So it is a daily deluge. And the other thing I suppose I should say is, we're not always looking at war and conflict. Often you're looking at, red carpet events and women's cricket, and so it's the whole spectrum of human life. But what we're looking for, is kind of the next question.
Yeah, and also I guess kind of how do you triage them then? So you got 30,000 images come in. Do different people look at different subsections, or do you all look at all of them? And then what makes some of them stand out? You know, do you see
Yeah.
instantly
Mm.
this is a good image, and what makes them?
So
pop out
yes,
for you?
we're sifting all the time and making edits from the materials coming from the day. But that's because we're informed by the stories that are happening, and we've all been to the news meeting first thing in the morning, so we know roughly what's on the agenda. But things unfold during the day. But what makes a picture jump out? I mean, it's interesting to hear the previous the curators talking about aesthetics, because I think aesthetic can play quite a big part in what catches your eye. So for us as picture editors, it's that level of engagement. It might be something that's very direct, or it might be something that is kind of carrying a weight of, human emotion. But I would say if it engages you in any way, put it to one side into your edit bucket, and we will consider it later, because you're not at that point, you're not necessarily able to really interrogate the circumstances or the caption information. So you don't always know exactly what it is you're looking at, but that's your kind of first level of sifting, I would say, is you're looking at a kind of aesthetic engagement.
Mm. And then once you've kind of got that image in your editing bucket, this is where, given the pace that you described, how do you kind of verify or contextualize it? Is it that because some of them come from trusted agencies, that's one level of trust, I imagine?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you rely on photographers that you yourself know in some sense, or what happens to it?
So there's definitely a bit of both going on there, and according to who has filed the picture to you. So I would say that the news agencies that we are provided images from, they have extraordinary reputations that they need to protect, as do we. So their relationship, we trust their relationship with the photographer. If they get that wrong, their reputation's damaged. The photographer may never work again. It's the funny thing is, even though it's 30,000 images and 1 million photographers, strangely we often know one another as well. It's quite an incredible community. So your reputation is everything, and that's why you trust that people are being truthful with you. The other thing that we often have to do, especially in a fast-paced news situation, is make sure that we really understand what it is we're looking at, and pause to establish the facts. And that's something that I think we've kind of we've refined, I would say, over the last 10 years. We want to make sure that for example, there were the terror attacks in London not so long ago. We were immediately, we received images of kind of, dead and injured people lying on London Bridge. And we needed to be sure whether those people were, some of them had survived their injuries, whether their families would have known that they had been victims of this attack, and that kind of thing. So you see, the photographer took the pictures. We could have published them within minutes, but we had to pause to kind of find out what the full picture of the story was, and also kind of consider the impact that publishing that picture might have had on somebody's family, their loved ones. And so there are always questions to ask, and there's a reason to pause to find out.
I suppose that's something that distinguishes a serious journalistic operation from the rapid approach of social media, I guess also of other websites that will publish things much more quickly. I mean, do you feel yourself in competition with them in some sense?
I mean, yes, to a degree, you are in competition, but I think what we've learned is fast is not always good. Accurate is much better. I mean, it's really, really important to The Guardian, to our readers, that our reputation for accuracy can be trusted.
Okay. Now, one of the topics of the exhibition, of course, is iconic images, no iconic images. And one thing that makes an image iconic usually is this emotional impact that it has. And it's a one long-standing conversation in the history of photography, right? The power of the photographic image specifically to move you emotionally because it transports you into that situation. So talking a little bit about that emotional impact, you said it's something that guides you towards the selection of the image. But I suppose a two-part question. What emotional impact do you seek these images to have on the readership? And secondly, what impact does it have on you as the people who are sifting through these huge amounts of quite disturbing images?
Yeah,
sometimes?
I mean, that is a really interesting question. I feel that personally, I'm quite an instinctive picture editor. I feel that look, of those 30,000 pictures, I've been doing this for such a long time. Every single day, I see pictures that, make my heart sing, that I think are beautiful. Every day, I see pictures that are horrific, that are absolutely heartbreaking, and that are deeply affecting, for all those reasons. But I do believe that if a picture moves me or has an effect on me, that I should show it to my peers and that we should have a discussion about that. Because it's a little bit about what I said earlier. The key is engagement. We want people to read the story, and the picture is often, as you can see around the room, it's the first kind of signal about of what that story is about. There's also quite a kind of delicate balance there between showing something that is so graphic that people will look away, because in a way, that's not the point. You do want them to engage with the story. So we often have to kind of find ways of doing that. I mean, and the other thing is that I don't think that's a form of censorship, really. I don't think it sort of sanitizes the truth, because often some of the pictures that we see of human suffering are so powerful. You don't have to see the dead body, but the repercussions of what's happened there are powerful enough to move people to want to know what the story is. And then just to kind of talk about your point of, our own emotional kind of process. It's, I think, the newsroom in the past has been quite a sort of macho place where you would try to kind of hide your feelings or about some of the stories that you're working on or some of the things that you were seeing. And I think we've had a really like a sea change. I mean, definitely in the last kind of 10 years, it's become much easier to talk about your mental health or to just admit that sometimes you are suffering. And I'm sure, there are photographers in this room as well who feel the same, that having some acknowledgement of that is actually quite important. And the reason it's important is we need to be match fit to do our jobs. So, in fact, I'm just trying to think back. This cycle of the Ukraine war was a kind of prompted some of the journalists, The Guardian, to say to our managing editors team, we are finding what we're seeing incredibly traumatic and really difficult. Please, can you help us? And so we've had some counselling, and we had it again at the time of October the 7th and then the subsequent bombardment of Gaza. And it's been so important to me because, I was just kind of guessing before then as to how to keep myself match fit. I think it's allowed us and given us permission to take time away, to rebalance your mind with different views of the world. And again, kind of take time to like walk your dog in, Kew Gardens or the Bluebell Wood or whatever. And not to feel guilty about that, because it's really easy, I think, for journalists and for photographers to feel that they're carrying the weight of the suffering of the story, of the people who are involved in the story that they're covering. So yes, it is allowed for you to come up for air.
That's really an interesting side, I think, something that hasn't occurred to me, because I always think about the effect that images have on the public, say, but to have the effect they have for some photographers, the people that have been photographed, but then on the editors, as you say. I mean, could you maybe, if it's not prying too much, sort of say a little bit more about those emotions that it provokes? Because I think one of them might be, as you said, a kind of, it surprised me that you said there's a kind of a feeling of guilt almost.
I think it's really, I think that guilt is a really kind of usual response, because you become so invested in a story. You really know that families in Gaza are losing their children every day. We see people walking through the streets carrying their dead children. I mean, it is horrific. The trauma that happened to people on October the 7th was equally horrific and terrifying. And I think as well, when you've been covering conflict for quite a long time, you think, oh, I know this. So, I'm kind of familiar with the pattern. And interestingly, the counsellor said to us often, you that think you know it are the ones who are at most risk. And funnily enough, that after October the 7th and the beginning of the conflict in Gaza, I did suffer from quite horrific nightmares that I hadn't really ever had before. So I think, yes, absolutely, we are saturated with this if we choose to be, and it's okay to take a break, because otherwise we can't do our jobs properly. You need to be able to see things with perspective as well.
I mean, it's interesting. There's a kind of a stereotype, I suppose, that being overly exposed to these images will desensitize you, and that people will become kind of numb in a way that doctors aren't bothered by blood, say.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, in terms of the audiences, that's another stereotype, I suppose, that we're bombarded through the kind of simulacrum of imagery. We've got this. This is the debate that started, I suppose, already with the Vietnam War, but then especially with CNN, this kind of constant access to theaters of war. And the point was at that point made that audiences are going to at some point become desensitized, that it just becomes a kind of a form of entertainment. I mean, do you think that's a wrong way of putting it? And do you think there are some examples maybe of images that broke through the apathy and made a difference in some way?
I mean, I definitely think there are different ways of telling the same story, and that's quite a kind of a skill for picture editors and for photographers. I think when you look around the room here, you'll see very graphic aftermath of missile attacks and people who are injured, but you will also see little moments of kind of humanity, of tenderness, I'm actually looking for them and I can't see that many here, but we publish stories about daily life in Ukraine and how people are just going about living, and that is another way of driving engagement and kind of empathy in a story as well, because you're looking to connect. So it's about are people going to get their hair done, and are they listening to music, and what's happened to the culture scene there. All of this is the fabric of our lives, and it really, so it's different ways of telling the same story about the conflict.
Maybe if we think a little bit about the ethics of taking the image or the kind of image that is being taken, are there rules there? Well, I'm sure there are rules there that you follow. Are there red lines around showing people in states of distress, showing people in states of losing their dignity, perhaps, showing dead bodies? All of these are things that, on one hand, motivate the human interest in the story and I guess show the horror for what it is, but at the same time are ethically difficult things to negotiate. What are your examples of rules on that?
I mean, we have no hard, fast rules, and I think that's probably quite important, because sometimes we have to make decisions according to the context. It is at times really important to have the photograph that is evidence. But at the same time, you have to really consider the impact on your subject. And dignity is a really big part of what we talk about. I mean, there is no controversial picture that we would ever publish at The Guardian without a really considered conversation about that. Whether that's children suffering or, an example. This is actually something that we did publish, and personally, I thought we shouldn't have done. And there was a terror attack on the airport in Brussels, and you may remember there was quite a well-circulated photograph that was just in the immediate aftermath of two women sitting on a bench, recovering from the shock of the explosion. And one woman had most of her clothes blown off, and she was in her underwear. And to me, we should not have published that picture because it was really undignified for her. It actually did end up becoming quite an emblematic picture because not everybody thought the same as me. But nevertheless, the woman herself did speak up about it afterwards and said exactly that she had found it really, really, it compounded her trauma that her image had circulated around the world in her bra. So I absolutely think, yes, again, we have to pause and always ask ourselves the question about what the impact of that image might be. And then there's another example of this, kind of where we would shy away. We would naturally want to shy away from showing pictures of dead bodies, dead children, for example. but I had a conversation with a well-known photographer, Lindsay Addario, about a picture that she took in Ukraine. It was in Irpin, and at the time, there was a huge denial from the Russian authorities about attacks on civilians. And the people were being evacuated through Irpin, and there was an attack that killed a mother and 2 children and injured the rest of the family members. Now, Lindsay was there and she took the photograph as evidence. And she showed it to her editors at the New York Times, who had the same kind of initial thought that I would have had, which is, well, we're not going to publish that because, it's just too horrific. And, those poor people. And, would you want to see the body of your dead child, spinning around the world on the internet? No, probably not. But what she knew was all of the people who had been involved in that on that day said, you must show this because we want the world to see what is happening, because there is a huge denial going on about this. And this is the truth. This is the evidence. And she persuaded her picture editors to publish it. And it did go on to win a Pulitzer Prize. It is really difficult. But again, knowing the context and having that discussion with the photographer can change everything. And that's why it's really, it's difficult, isn't it? That conversation you were having earlier about seeing things in an exhibition where perhaps you don't have the context and you don't have the caption information and you don't know exactly what the circumstances were around that picture. And perhaps that's why we struggle sometimes with a picture that becomes iconic, because at some point it's removed from its context, from its original context.
Now, one of these images that was one of the many well-known examples of images that show something horrific, but become in some sense iconic and maybe make a difference, was the dead boy on the beach in 2015 during the refugee crisis. And I remember you took a very specific approach to that, which I think it'd be interesting to hear about.
Yeah,
Would you like to say a bit
right.
about that?
It was a horrific event when, and you will probably all remember it, the body of the little boy, who was only 2 years old, Aylan Kurdi, washed up on the beach in Turkey. Actually, it was quite near Bodrum, and we know Bodrum as being, like a holiday place. And it was coming at a point where there'd been a lot of reporting about refugees, that refugee kind of exodus into Europe, but very little very little action from European governments, or, it was really only kind of aid agencies and local people who were helping. So it was an image that every newspaper editor chose to publish because it was so horrific. And really, the point of what we're doing often is to affect change. And I think, and to move global opinion about something as well. And it did just that. But, oh, yeah, you're right. The way that we chose to publish it was slightly different to the way others chose. So most of the news organizations just showed the little boy's body on the beach. But it was so harsh. And there was then a kind of an aid worker who collected him and lifted him up into his arms. And that was the one that we chose to use. It just felt more that it needed to have that kind of tender, humane approach to kind of honor the family's loss, really. And it was really interesting because, whether that change lasts, it's hard to say, but definitely it did galvanize European governments into, kind of changing policy. And it also incited a huge amount of public donation to the refugee aid agencies. So in some respects, it did make a difference. And then you think, well, perhaps the family felt in the end that their child didn't die entirely in vain. But I was going to say it was a difficult decision to reach, but actually I don't think it was. I think at that particular point, everybody in the room realized it was absolutely the right thing to do, to publish the picture, but a very rare occurrence.
It's really interesting to hear the fact there aren't any clear and fast rules, and that you have to go through this process, sort of conversation by conversation. That's what you
Exactly,
describe.
exactly. And it's never unilateral, you know. I mean, it's another thing I like about working at The Guardian. It's a really collaborative place where, you know, as a group of editors, we all have a voice. And so, you know, somebody will bring something that can perhaps kind of, you know, change the direction of travel. But that's really, really important that, you know, that it is a collaboration. And also, you know, we're a kind of increasingly a more diverse group of people who have different lived experiences. And so everybody, you know, kind of brings a perspective that is really vital.
So one of the big changes, I guess, with the digital age and more recently is that, of course, anyone could be a photographer now, right? Everyone has a phone, and it's done something interesting to images that are coming from theaters of conflict, theaters of war, in that oftentimes those amateur photographs are the first bit of information that we get. I mean, we saw that really strongly during the Arab Spring, or now more recently with Gaza, where journalists weren't allowed in. I should mention Max and Vika during the biennial exhibition curated a work by Danilo Revkovsky and Andrei Rachinsky, who collaged all of this footage taken by amateurs of the beginnings of the full-scale invasion, and they collaged in an extraordinary way, which I would really recommend people have a look at. But how has that impacted on your decisions as editor? The fact that you could be getting images from all these different people, and how likely are you to publish them, for example?
I mean, I would say that yes, they tend to go through some form of a filtering system in that, you know, it is still really important for us to try to reach out to journalistic sources in various regions and to try to verify the facts of what's happening. So it may be that you do choose to use a picture that's been taken by, you know, a member of the public, but you might want to verify that with a journalist who has some knowledge of the situation, so that you can get to the kind of truth of it. But often, you know, one of the things you would consider access. Yes, absolutely. Gaza has been a huge problem for us because we are relying only on the people who are trapped in Gaza. We can't send anybody in there. And I know the BBC have talked a lot about this as well. You know, whenever they're kind of accused of having a slant on their journalism, it's really hard because they can't get there to see for themselves. There have been news organizations who have embedded with the Israeli army, for example, and that is equally problematic. In the past, yes, we've sent photographers to embed in Afghanistan with the British military and in Iraq with the US military. And that comes with its, so you've got two things. Yes, you've got access, and secondly, you've got protection, but you don't necessarily have impartiality. You may be stopped from photographing something. There might be, they might be going through your work before you file it. So it's difficult, but maybe it's the only way. So if it is, then what we would always do is try to signal that to our readers, to say, look, these are the circumstances under which this picture's been taken, so that you're not patronizing people, but you have to be really kind of clear and transparent about how those images have been surfaced. But I think I was going to tell you about a couple of really young guys in the war in Syria. They were, I think, 15 and 16, and they just wanted to try to show the world what was happening in their, to their community. And they picked up cameras and they managed to make contact with AFP, and they were filing their pictures through AFP. They have both turned out to be incredible photojournalists who are now living and working in France. And in fact, one of them's done a lot of documentary work with the migrants in Calais. Also, they've become refugees themselves from war because, AFP helped to get them out of the country. So they also have an experience of what it's like to be a refugee and to be the subject of, journalistic practice. So, in fact, I know that Samir has recently been back to Syria as well, and he thought he'd never be able to go back there to see his family again. But so they were 15 and 17 when they started making their pictures, and really kind of I think they've both won World Press Awards since. So yes, we depend upon information from communities. But that said, there's another kind of little caveat to that. we would never want to encourage somebody, a young person without any training to say, well, I just fancy going off to war. I think, in the days of Michael Hirst Dispatches, that's absolutely what people did. They just kind of went for the adventure. But, it's not safe, and we don't want you to be injured or maimed or killed, to make a story for The Guardian. We only work with people who have been hostile environment trained, who have the appropriate kit, and we send them to work with our security teams as well. So it's really kind of important to say that, just, if you know anybody who has a dream for that kind of adventure, it's just not something that we would encourage in any way.
Maybe just one last question before we turn to the audience, which is that, okay, we talked about how everyone has a phone to take pictures, but also a phone to look at pictures. And one of the big challenges that we're all talking about, of course, is misinformation. And I guess in the case of images, that has to do with images being divorced from their context, appearing often in propaganda. People are also not necessarily reading The Guardian. I am, but but people are getting their information from other sources. How do you see yourself operating within this changed landscape, and what challenges does it present?
Yeah, I mean, this is really difficult. I mean, I think probably like my own children who are adults now get a lot of information from, YouTube, from TikTok. Everybody is delving into social media, and these are not necessarily trusted sources. And it might not be entirely apparent to the kind of next generation how problematic that is, but it will become apparent, I think. I mean, I think, should we be afraid of that as The Guardian? I think, no, absolutely not. What we have to do is defend our reputation. And then people will know that if they come to us, they have, the stories and the photography that we're sourcing, that we're sharing are, that they come from a place of fact, of investigation, and and of rigor. And I think that will become increasingly important. And especially, Donald Trump is, peddling this myth about fake news all the time, and then accusing and labeling journalists. And I think that there is a point at which you do have to defend that. It's really, really, it's kind of like the last line in the sand, isn't it?
Well, it's a hopeful note to end our conversation on. But are there any questions from the audience? Yes, the lady at the back.
Hello. Hi. I'd like to say, first of all, there was a phrase you used early on that really meant a lot to me, reason to pause. And I really appreciate that The Guardian takes the amount of care that it does in selecting and publishing the photographs connected with conflicts around the world. I grew up in Northern Ireland through the Troubles, came over to England in '74. I did lose my dad indirectly as a result of the Troubles. And I have to say that, during that time, we're there, here, watching everything that went out on the news and photography, the numbing effect that photographs often have, and the turning away that people can do as a result of being numbed. So there's a lot of, different kind of considerations, as you say yourself, and not easy ones to make. This current conflict in Gaza is one that weighs very heavily on my heart, and early on in the conflict, The Guardian published a Gaza diary, a young man called Ziad. I have a reading group in Southport that's been meeting for 13 years, and we followed that story. And I have to say that the photographs connected with the story were ones that were deeply meaningful to me, because I was reading his story, and this was his context that he was living in, and it ended, I can't think exactly But I've really appreciated the stories connected with that conflict, where it's very hard to get it, the truth of what is happening there, where individuals' stories are being told. And I think the other thing that I wanted to just kind of say in relation to that, both the wars in Palestine and in Afghanistan, there's a kind of political narrative that these are people we can't really identify with because they're not like us. And The Guardian telling those stories of individuals who are very much like us, have families, have the same, relationships, emotions. It felt very important that those were the stories being told, both, in words and in pictures. And again, I'd just like to say I really appreciate.
Well, thank you, but that just it's really important to say as well that all of this work is made through the kind of courage and commitment and dedication of the photojournalists in the field. And without them, we wouldn't have this information. And they're incredibly brave people and very selfless. And just it's really important to to make the point that the work they do is so vital, and we should all really be very grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the point. Just a bit briefly for people because of the audio, about the importance of photography to bring us into a personal story, which enabled you to connect with the story of the boy in Gaza. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, there's a hand right there at the back. Yeah, Richard.
Hi, Richard Dupont. I'm a lecturer at the University of Liverpool's Media and Communications Department. I wanted to ask a question around the earlier part of the talk, this sort of showing images of death, bodies, horror, and it ties to something from the previous talk where the speakers were talking about an exhibition space where the decision was we're not going to show dead bodies because this will cause a stir, paraphrasing slightly, and this is this is one of the reasons why we might not want to show the horror on the walls. The question here is, I'm like, why? It's about like, why do we shy away from showing people like truly horrific images? And it feels like it's grounded in one of two objections. One is sometimes it's dignity objection, so to show someone's body in pain is a problem of dignity for them or their family. But often this dignity defense doesn't get deployed about a specific image. So people deploy this idea of, we shouldn't show dead bodies because it's a dignity problem before we even consider, is this image a dignity problem? So it's to say, I'm not accusing the Guardian of this, but in something where you say in our gallery space, we're not going to show bleeding and death and suffering because we're worried about the dignity of victims, you're deploying the defense before you know if it even kind of obtains. The second is this thing that, and the Island Kurdi image is an example of this, where in response to the image amongst many sort of breakfast tables in the UK was this thing like, oh my God, I'm traumatized by seeing this. I the British serial eater, am traumatized by seeing this image. And there's a sort of implicit assertion that we, the audiences of relatively stable, wealthy, highly securitized countries, have some sort of right not to be shown things that will traumatize us. And I kind of, when you were talking about nightmares in the Guardian staff, I sometimes wonder why we think that audiences of nations and societies that profit from the security or other regimes that cause or implicate in the suffering elsewhere, why do we as audiences not deserve nightmares? Like where does this right come from that we are allowed to say, oh, I would not like to see these things because they would traumatize me? It's something we sort of like take for granted often, and if the thing that makes war an issue of moral concern is suffering, why are we willing to entertain a right of an audience to say, oh, I don't want to see the kind of fundamental moral thing?
Well, if you look around these walls, there are many graphic, horrific images of suffering. And so I don't think that we entirely censor that away from out of the media. I don't think it's taken away entirely. But what I do, I kind of come back to that point about engagement. And if somebody is going to say, oh my God, I'm not going to look at this because I'm having my breakfast at the moment. I mean, it's a bit lame. I get that. But what you really want to do is to is to entice somebody to want to know more about that story. And if the image makes somebody look away, then you've kind of lost your audience. So I think you've got to be really kind of savvy about, yes, the truth of what conflict brings to people, so that you're not entirely sanitizing that experience, but that you also engage people to want to know more about it rather than to look away. And it's kind of human instinct, isn't it? Or you have this kind of like slightly gratuitous approach where perhaps you're showing dead bodies just because people are kind of fascinated to look at a dead body. And maybe that's not appropriate within this context either. So I do think it's about sort of trying to channel engagement without being patronizing or censoring the reality. And that's what we try to do.
Thank you so much, Fiona. This was, I thought, a fascinating conversation and insight, and a great basis for talking also to some of the photographers in later sessions. Thanks to all of you. Let's thank Fiona.